The best place to start when talking about Buddhism is the founding myth of Buddhism, which is the story of the life of Siddhartha Gautama. And so people do believe that Siddhartha Gautama existed, but of course there's not a whole lot of reliable historical documentation to back up the founding myth of Buddhism. So I'm going to give you the myth, and I'll leave it up to you to decide how much of it is historical truth. So anyway, the story starts out with Siddhartha being born as the son of a Hindu prince. And when he's born, there is a prophecy that he will give up his position as the son of a prince and wander around India as a poor holy man. The father, of course, does not want this, so he decides to shelter Siddhartha from all of the pain and suffering of the world and to show him how wonderful life as a prince can be. So he builds him a beautiful palace, he fills it up with a beautiful garden, he has a beautiful woman for Siddhartha to marry, they have wonderful children, and everything seems great. He basically lives the best life that you could hope to live in ancient India. But one day, Siddhartha decides to leave his palace and he goes for a ride on the roads nearby. And while he is on the road, he sees three men, which reveal to him the true nature of human existence. The first man he sees is sick. He has sores all over his body, and he's thin and crawling by the side of the road. And this freaks Siddhartha out. But he keeps going, and then later he sees an old man, and he has never seen old age in his life. But this old man is walking on a cane, he's bent, his eyes are sunken into his head, and this disturbs Siddhartha even more, especially when he learns that he eventually will also grow old. And finally, he sees by the side of the road a dead person, decomposing, and when he learns that this is the ultimate fate of all human beings, he realizes that life in the sheltered palace is pointless. And so rather than returning, he gives up everything he has, he leaves his wife and family, and he wanders into the forests of India, determined to overcome humanity's fates of suffering, sickness, and death. So first, while he's wandering around in the forests of India, he turns to ancient Hindu practices in order to overcome suffering. Because remember, in Hinduism, you can overcome suffering by practicing yoga to overcome selfish desire and achieve moksha. So anyway, the Buddha tries all that stuff, and he tries fasting, and he tries all sorts of different meditations and stuff like that. But none of the ancient Hindu practices seem to work. So he gives up on all this and wanders off by himself and decides that he is simply going to meditate non-stop until he comes up with a solution to the problem of human suffering. And so he sets out a bunch of bowls of rice around him, and he sits down under a tree, and for 48 days he sits meditating, doing nothing but eating rice and meditating the whole time. And while he is sitting there meditating, he is tempted by all sorts of demons. They come up and they try to prevent him from having this breakthrough that he's working towards. But he resists the temptations of the demons, and he reaches a state known as nirvana, or enlightenment. And through his nonstop meditation, he has reached this breakthrough in how to escape human suffering. And this breakthrough, it becomes the religion that we know as Buddhism. So let's talk about what exactly he realized after sitting under the tree for 48 days. Well, so the first thing we need to recap is that the Buddha believed that human beings can never escape suffering, and not even death can end suffering, right? Because if we stopped existing when we died, then the way to end suffering would be very easy. We would just have to stop existing. But the Buddha believed, like the Hindus, that human beings were reincarnated, and that after you died, you were doomed to live again as a human and to suffer again. And so he believed that in order to escape from suffering, we had to do something else besides just live and die over and over again. So what do we do? The answer to the problem of human suffering, and the thing that the Buddha realizes after his 48 days of meditation, is all of the stuff we're going to talk about on this slide. So the first thing he realizes are called the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is that all life is sorrow. Human beings cannot hope to escape sorrow in human existence, no matter what. And he believes, furthermore, the second noble truth is that the cause of sorrow is desire. So human beings, as they live, desire certain objects that are fated to pass away. Nothing we can hope to attain in this world will last. And so whenever we reach out and seek to hold on to something or desire something, this will ultimately lead us to suffering when we can't hold on to that thing. Therefore, the Buddha concludes that the only cure for sorrow is to eliminate all desire. That way, if we stop holding on to things, we will stop losing things, if that makes sense. To overcome desire, and this is the tricky part, the Buddha believes that you have to follow something called the Eightfold Path. And I don't want to go into all 8 folds of this path, but basically the Eightfold Path tells people how they ought to live. And it says that one must practice wisdom, they must practice ethical conduct, and mindfulness and contemplation. And the key to success in all of these things, the Buddha believes, is to practice meditation. And we already talked about meditation with yoga as a part of Hinduism. But the basic idea of meditation is that you still your mind. And instead of constantly moving from one thing to another, one object of desire to another, is you sit down and you're still your mind and you simply exist. And by learning to still your mind and to simply exist, you will eventually reach the point where you can escape from all of your pointless desires. Once you practice the Eightfold Path and you practice meditation long enough, the idea is that you will eventually reach this state called nirvana. And nirvana is a transformational experience of the mind, supposedly. It is the elimination of all desire and selfishness. You basically become a new person. Your mind is completely altered. Not only do you escape from all selfishness and all anger and all suffering and all the bad stuff, but you also escape from the cycle of rebirth. And what this means is that when you die, after attaining nirvana, instead of being reincarnated to suffer once again, you leave the cycle of reincarnation and you return to the source of all existence, which the Hindus would call Brahman. And I don't know what the Buddhas call it. So you might have noticed that there are some important similarities between Buddhism and Hinduism. And you notice this because there are. The first important similarity is reincarnation. Both Buddhists and Hindus believe that human beings are stuck in a cycle of human existence, and that not only do we live over and over again, but that living over and over again is bad because life is suffering. The goal in both Buddhism and Hinduism is to escape existence as a human being and to return to the true source of reality, which is this impersonal, unchanging, eternal thing that the Hindus call Brahma. So you want to stop existing as an individual and to fade into this cosmic reality. That's what their goal is, rather than heaven or whatever. So to escape from existence, you have to attain a state that the Buddhists call nirvana, that the Hindus call moksha. It is escape from selfish desire and escape from all suffering. But there are important differences as well. Buddhism, first of all, rejects the caste system. They believe that everybody should pursue this path of wisdom through meditation. And they believe that anybody can attain enlightenment with the right effort. And therefore that you don't have to wait to become a Brahmin to seek moksha. Buddhism also rejects worship as a means to salvation, at least originally. They believe that if you want to be free, if you want to attain enlightenment, you have to do it yourself. You cannot pray to a deity to save you. And so this leads us to a critical question, which I want you to think about. Does Buddhism really break away from Hinduism, or is Buddhism just another form of the Hindu practice of yoga? I don't know the answer, but I want you to think about it based on what you know about the two religious traditions. Soon after Buddhism arises and begins to spread as a form of religious practice, it splits into two different versions. The first version and the old school version of Buddhism, the one based on what the Buddha actually taught, is called Theravada Buddhism, which means the narrow path. And so, like I said, this is based on the Buddha's original teachings, and only a few people can hope to attain enlightenment in any given life. This means that only the people that dedicate their whole lives to meditation and the Eightfold Path can hope to reach nirvana. Everybody else has to wait and hope that in some other life they will be reborn as somebody with the spiritual power to attain nirvana. The newer version of Buddhism that appears really not that long after Theravada Buddhism appears is called Mahayana Buddhism. And this stands for the greater path. And Mahayana Buddhists believe that the Buddha and other immortal enlightened beings, which they call bodhisattvas, can help the unenlightened not only to reach nirvana, but also to live better lives in the world of human suffering. And so normal people pray to the bodhisattvas and to the Buddha like gods, even though the Buddha specifically said that he did not want to be worshipped like a god. Also, the Mahayana Buddhists believe that there are many heavens and many hells. So when you die, you don't necessarily get reborn on earth, but you could be reborn in hell if you live a bad life, or be reborn in heaven if you live a good life. And in heaven and hell, then you also have the opportunity to live and to die and to be reborn again. So it's a much more supernatural version of Buddhism than the original Theravada approach. There are also lots of other forms, but we don't need to talk about those. Theravada and Mahayana are the big ones. Last of all, we need to talk about the spread of Buddhism. So Buddhism appears in northern India, right on the banks of the Ganges, but it quickly spreads out from there. Theravada Buddhism doesn't spread very widely. You could imagine that it wouldn't be very popular because it says that only people who work super duper hard have any chance of escaping human suffering. That doesn't sell very well, but it does spread pretty far into Southeast Asia and also to the island of Sri Lanka. Mahayana Buddhism, which says all you have to do is pray to a bodhisattva and they will take you to heaven and help you attain enlightenment there, is much more popular. And this spreads all through China and eventually into Korea and Japan. And we'll learn more about how this form of Buddhism changes and develops in East Asia later on. And the other forms of Buddhism, which I've chosen not to tell you about, spread into Tibet and Mongolia, as well as into Nepal and other mountain countries in the Himalayas. Interestingly, though, Buddhism eventually fades away in India itself. It's reabsorbed by Hinduism. And now, within Hinduism, the Buddha is seen as a god, but not as this exceptional being that created his own religious following. So that's interesting. That gives you something to think about in terms of whether Buddhism and Hinduism are really separate entities when they start out. So here are your key terms. You'll probably be pleased to see that there are only 3 of them tonight. So instead of writing down key terms, why don't you contemplate the meaning of human existence and suffering for a little while as your homework.